Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Breakfast with Bobby. I am your co-host, Christina. I'm here with my co-host, Bobby, and our friend Marcus is back again. Hi, guys. How you doing?
Yay,
Good. How are
Marcus.
you?
Yeah.
I'm fabulous.
Yeah, it's a great day, isn't it?
It is.
It's spectacular. So, Marcus, welcome back. Remember the last time we were here, you were
I
talking
do.
about the radiant child. And since there's so much to talk about, we
Oh yeah.
decided that we needed to do a part two on this.
Yep.
Um, there's so much to this. And I got to tell you, when I started this whole process, I looked at the 6 archetypes for this particular model. And I said to myself, oh, I'm pretty sure I'm not the needy child. I'm pretty sure I'm not this. I'm pretty sure I'm all of them. Just saying.
Aren't
Almost all of them.
aren't we all of them?
Well,
I
We
mean,
yeah.
isn't
are.
that kind
Yeah.
of the premise? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, every individual is all, the 6 archetypes come down to overdramatic, misunderstood, needy, overindulged, frozen, and lost. So those, and we'll go through them all, but like basically we're everything. And everyone like makes it's the ones when you go in and you're like kind of looking and mapping out your understanding of your any part of your consciousness. They're like the highlights of what you lean towards and what you've been conditioned with and which ones are super activated in you, but the rest of them are all there too.
Hmm.
So, people are like, I'm everything. And I'm like, you're everything. Yes, it's true. And there are some that play out all the time. They're like your greatest hits, right? Like the what's on rotation on your radio station. So, usually that comes from our conditioning, totally from our conditioning. So yes, when people look at it and they're like, but I'm all those things, you are to a certain degree, but some play more of a stronger role than others. And that's the way to look at it.
Hmm.
Um, so because some people are like, I'm absolutely not that. And I'm like, well, there's definitely parts of you that have that going on. All of these are just stories or archetypes of this wounded part. I mean, the wounded inner child's an interesting thing because it is probably one of the most powerful parts of our consciousness because all of the wounds that ever happened to us that are what influence all our relationships moving forward all stem from this one area of our lives. Like all of our primal wounds, all of our sacred wounds, everything that comes from lives in that wounded inner child. Now, and people would say to me, well, I mean, why is that the case? Why is there all this woundedness? But if you think about it as a child, when you come into this world, your psychology is not developed. So you're getting influenced, you're getting access, and you're getting exposure to your family of origin and your culture, all of whom have conditioned experiences of their own issues, right? Their own personality structure. And as this innocent child that has no understanding of anything, like the psychology of a young child has, it just absorbs everything from its environment. There's no judgment, there's no discernment, there's no making any assessments. It's just you're taking everything in. And what happens is that the only tool that unsophisticated psychology has in order to work with something that's not in harmony with the way it functions is fragmentation. So what we do is we have these conditionings. We don't have the psychological wherewithal to work with it. And so our only survival technique is fragment into different components in order to manage, store, and leave that stuff somewhere, put it somewhere so that we can function and survive until at some point you revisit that fragmented part and find some kind of resolution. So the inner child, the wounded inner child, is some way is kind of like a holding area for all the unfavorable things that have happened to us that we don't have the ability to process in a sophisticated psychological way. So we fragment it and we shove it down into the unconscious world of our being, and we store it in these kind of categories and stories, and that's how we handle it. So when you think about that, if you're going into the spiritual journey of self-development, where is the most powerful place to start your process in terms of understanding what your conditioning is? Will be in the wounded inner child.
Yeah.
That's where it all lives, right? And again, we hear this, you hear this thing because we hear people talk about the inner child all the time. And they're like, well, I'm doing inner child work. And I'm like, but be very clear about what kind of inner child work you're doing. Because like we talked about last time, there's a very distinct difference to the radiant inner child, which is the access of all of your divinity and all of these untapped potential of consciousness, as opposed to the wounded inner child. So the radiant inner child can be developed, it can be cultivated. The wounded inner child is what you already have stored in there based on the conditioning you received in your family of origin as a survival technique. All that unfavorable stuff got put into this category. And if you don't go down there, you don't go in there and start accessing it and making it conscious, it starts to unconsciously influence every single relationship you'll ever have in your life. That's why it's powerful.
Yeah.
Right? The potential for healing is massive.
Yes.
In the wounded inner child. Massive.
I
And I mean, even just becoming aware of it is a huge deal.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
there's so many archetypes in this that, and again, they really drill into your heart, and you have to look at that and say, oh my God, am I that? But I had a bit of a meltdown when I started it, and I thought, oh my God, I'm not the needy child, because I'm really pretty self-sufficient, and
Yeah.
I make my needs known pretty well, I think. And so when I was evaluating all of this, I was sure I was not many of these, only to figure out that just the fact that I'm not a high maintenance person, which I equated to a needy child
Right.
or a misunderstood child. Again, I think I communicate quite well, and I'm pretty sharp at telling you what I need. And so when I'm often not misunderstood in terms of, but then when I went through the whole scale of things, it was really, it was a bit painful to really identify with all that. But, on the other side of that, it was really eye-opening, how you behave and how you go about doing all of what you're supposed to be doing on the inside of you. It's really a game changer. This one right here is the big deal.
Yeah, it accesses deep stuff, right? I mean, and all those fragmented parts that we've put aside for survival mechanisms to fragment off that we couldn't handle as a child. And now we have the opportunity to go back in to really engage with some of these aspects of self and to reparent ourselves in the way that we always wanted to be parented, instead of this stuff getting shoved deep into the unconscious. That's the resolve. The resolve is meeting this stuff, getting first of all, getting honest about what runs you, and then from there going deeper into kind of being available and healing not because someone says, well, I want to heal the issue. I'm like, you never heal your conditioning, you heal your relationship to your conditioning. So everyone thinks that like when you heal your issues that they go away. That's not true at all. What happens is you develop a more healthy relationship with the fragmentation that's already present in your consciousness, and you're able to meet it in a very conscious way. So when it arises, you have powerful tools to be able to work with it. And then the charge, all the emotional charge that's in there that makes that stuff really sticky and really affects your relationships, you work on that emotional charge and it mellows everything out. And then you become more adept at having an intimate relationship with these fragments, which ultimately just allows you to be a more conscious being in all your relationships, right?
I love how you're explaining this, because I'm a hypnotist and I help people with finding their fragmented soul parts. And the way that you're explaining it makes so much sense.
And
So much sense.
a lot of people don't want to see it that way. But
Yeah.
if you think about it that way, then okay, you're never going to get rid of it. So you might as well get intimate with it.
Right.
All of your conditioning you might as well get intimate with, because at some point it's not going away, but your relationship to it can completely change.
Right.
And so we see this thing in people's relationship with the inner child, and we see this thing between childish and childlike. So a lot of the most evolved beings I've ever been around, the most enlightened beings with this consciousness that's unbelievable, that I've had the privilege of being around, they are childlike, right? They have this childlike, innocent quality. That's the radiant inner child. Childish is the immaturity of it's the shadow reflection of that inner child, the immaturity of that inner child, and it's in how it influences relationships. And we all know what I'm talking about in terms of dealing with someone who's childish and immature, right?
Mm-hmm.
They live in a wounded, victimized state. By the way, all victimization is wounded inner child. Anyone who's victimized by anything, whether that be their sensitivity, the world around them, an individual, when you lean into that victim, you're leaning into the disempowered, immature aspect of your being, right? So this is, like you said, Bobby, this is such a powerful thing, because accessing this can move you from unconscious immaturity to maturity, in the sense of being able to address and be available in relationships not in a childish way. And I mean, and when we're looking for conscious relationships, if you're a conscious being and you want to be in conscious relationship, you don't want to be in relationship with a man-child, right? Someone who doesn't have
Right.
any awareness of their immaturity, and they live in that immature state, even though their age may be 60, their maturity may be their childish maturity, their wounded inner child may be 13. They may be locked in a 13-year-old level of immaturity in terms of their emotions. That's because they've never done any inner child work. They've never done any work with their wounded inner child. So this stuff starts to get into those places that we use as survival in order to function in a world where we didn't have the ability and the sophistication to be able to discern all the stuff that's going on. So the only thing we have is fragment, put it away, put it aside, put it in the unconscious, hold it in the vault. And that's what the wounded inner child is. It's this powerful vault of opportunity for healing, powerful opportunity for healing. So the first thing because there's always an entry point. There's an entry point for every aspect of our being. In maturity, the entry point is full availability, the available adult. In the radiant inner child, the access point to the radiant child, it's all about feeling, the connection to your emotional body, which deepens you. In the shadow, the entry point into the shadow is that whole idea of the unavailable adult. We're not available, right? The entry point into the wounded inner child is the overdramatic child. We mentioned it on the last call. We started talking about it. We talked about, like in the supermarket, when you see the kid throwing the tantrum and the mother trying to handle the child, that is the epitome of the overdramatic child. And it's the voice box for the rest of all the fragments. So it's a cry for help, right? The overdramatic child, which most people have tons of judgment of. But when you have tantrums, acting out, drama, sabotage, attention seeking, all of that is your wounded inner child way of trying to get your attention and get attention so that it can get access, it can be seen, understood, and then eventually resolved. So the overdramatic child, which most people have so much judgment of, is a powerful tool. It's the biggest tool that the wounded inner child has, the voice box to get your attention, right? So as soon as how this plays out, for instance, in relationships or in yourself, is one of the biggest things is your saboteur. Like for me, when I work on projects, because of my conditioning that said, hey, you'll never amount to anything, which we'll use that as which most people have heard in some way, shape, or form. You're not good enough. You never amount to anything. Whatever you actually heard versus what you internalized, but maybe I internalized I'm not going to amount to anything. So my overdramatic child, my saboteur, usually plays out right at the end of completion of a task, right? So everybody's saboteur plays out in a particular way. Some people sabotage prior to the task because they disempower themselves. Some people, like me, you get just to the place of success, and when you're going to be successful in completion, the sabotage comes in. So it's really powerful for you have that too, right? So it's really
Yeah.
powerful for you as an individual to understand where is and how does my saboteur work, because that's going to show up in relationships. So if your relationship gets too expansive and everything's moving too well and things are smooth, a lot of people will create incidents and drama to mix up the situation because their saboteur is playing out, because they're not comfortable with the level of expansion that they're feeling in their relationship. So people will ultimately, if you don't know your saboteur, that thing plays out all over your life, in completion of tasks, in your work, in your relationships, in all different ways. So that's why when you start listening and being available to the voice of the wounded inner child, which is the overdramatic child, you start to get access to it's starting to tell you, hey, I need attention. I need love. I need compassion. I need availability. I need to be seen. See what's in here so that we can work it out, so that you can kind of get a different relationship with it, or else it'll all continue to come out sideways, covert, and unintentionally and unconsciously, it'll affect every relationship in your life. And this is what most people live in, by the way.
Yeah.
They live
Mhm.
with an unresolved wounded inner child, so it shows up all over their relationships. And then they wonder, why do I sabotage? Why do I create certain circumstances with people? Why do I feel insecure? Blah, blah, blah. All of that comes from this place. So it's powerful. It's a powerful place, which is why in my book, it's the first chapter. It's like, go into the wounded inner child. People are like, can we start with something like fun and nice and happy? And I'm like, sure, if you want. But typically I start with this because this is where all the gold is. Because if it's unresolved, if it's unseen, it's unknown, it's affecting you. It's
Mhm.
affecting you on some level. And like you said, when you start to reclaim and integrate those fragments, right?
Yeah.
Like these fragments of your personality, and they start to get integrated, they're no longer running rogue and sabotaging things that are going on. You have a relationship with them. When they come up, you're like, wait a second, I know that that's neediness. Wait a second, I know that that's overindulged. Wait a second, I know that I feel misunderstood. I know how to handle that. I know how to reparent myself so that I don't need somebody in my outer world to do it for me, which is
Yes.
how most people function in their relationships.
So in your last podcast, when you were starting to talk about that, you mentioned the journaling aspect where, you ask yourself the question, how do you feel? And you write the answer with your non-dominant hand, and it looks like a
Right.
child. Is that the point of, when your inner child is yelling about, I need attention? Is that when you would bring up the journal and do that
Well,
part?
that's kind of like going into the gym and lifting 500-pound weights without ever practicing.
Oh,
So I would say that practice is your maintenance of availability to your inner child. So you don't want a lot of people want to do it when they're in trauma, and that actually doesn't serve anything. I mean, it does to a degree, but it's not the same as if you work the muscle and you build the skill of being available so that when something does come up, you already have the skill of how to be available. So that kind of reparenting the inner child journaling work, that if that's done as a regular technique, functioning through that and doing that as a regular thing, you'll build the muscle. So when something does happen, you're less likely to get unconsciously affected by it. So, but if you're trying to do it when it happens, it's very difficult when you're in emotional charge to do something like that,
I would
right?
just like to jump in here and say Bobby and I are both the kind of people, like when trauma hits, we just turn around and bam, head on, let's fix this. But it doesn't always work that way.
It's a little more, it's not
Yeah.
ineffective. It's just not as effective of building the muscle ahead of time, right?
Right.
So
Right.
I did the practice of that practice you're talking about, that
Mhm.
journaling practice, which I call reparenting the inner child. I did it for 5 years every single day. And I'm telling you, it completely changed my entire relationship with not only my wounded inner child, but also my radiant inner child. And I did it because I knew that I needed to be available, and I didn't know how to be available because we're not taught this. Like, unless you have a mature parent who has a relationship with their own wounded inner child or their shadow, and they emulate tools on how to be able to negotiate these parts of themselves, how do we know how to get available to this stuff? Like, we don't have, if we don't have examples and we don't have tools, then we're coming at it really blind, which is why most people say it's not that they don't want to do the work, it's that they don't necessarily know how. Like, how
Right.
do I go in there
Yeah.
and start having a different relationship with this stuff?
Right.
So, I mean, so this is why I did the tools. I'm like, listen, tools are important, use them. So that tool of you, what the journaling process is, with your right hand, you write, how do I feel? And with your non-dominant hand, which is basically your inner child, you answer and you go back and forth and commune. And then the second question is, what do you need? And then again, you switch over and you do that writing. That is a tool of teaching you how to be present, available, and and with your inner child in a way that you wished you were but never had growing up. So you're reparenting yourself internally the way you always wanted to be parented but weren't. And when you do that, you change the energy in your inner world. And when you change the energy in your inner world, it reflects in your outer world. So it's always an inside job, always,
It's very
right?
powerful. Yeah, it's very powerful.
It's
It is.
powerful. I mean, and people are like, I'm like, don't trust me on this. Do it and see what your experience is. I always say, yeah, you can take the information, you can take the kind of the counsel and the guidance, but my thing is where the rubber meets the road is you doing the activity. That's when you get the direct experience and you see for yourself and you go, oh, wow, okay. So yeah, that tool is effective, or no, that tool isn't effective to me. So I always say to people, don't take my word for it without doing the tool. Go do the tool, test it, examine it. And that's when usually people come back and go, okay, I've done the inner child writing for a couple of months now, and there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. I'm like, okay, great. Now I can help you with that. Let's go in there. And I usually have my clients do a variation. And I will tell you this, of all of my clients, I would say that there's maybe between 15 and 20% of people who actually will do this, because you're going to go in and you're going to face stuff, right? Like you said, Bobby,
Yes.
like I didn't want to know all of these things that were going on with me. I didn't want to be the needy child. I didn't want to be that. So, and everyone thinks that their conditioning is the worst.
You know,
But
I
the
would
thing
just
is,
like to say too that with that, like, I understand why Bobby wouldn't want to be the needy child. I didn't want to be the needy child because anytime we needed something, we were shamed for it.
Yeah.
but you know what's interesting about the needy child is we have such judgment of that, right? We see that as the person who sucks, the person who is like trying to garner attention. But I mean,
The
the
weak
truth is,
one. Yeah.
the weak one, the one that's whining. I mean, we have this whole story about the needy child, right? But it's that grasping, attention seeking thing. But if you look at it, if you look at the basis of what the needy child is, it's unmet needs.
Yeah.
Period. That's what it is. And if you understand that you have a needy child thing going on, then all of your work is around understanding how to speak your needs so that you're not unconsciously and covertly trying to manipulate your needs from another individual. That's all it is. That's all it comes down to, right? So if you know that that's part of your conditioning, then speaking your needs is a fundamental tool, and it is a fundamental tool in relationships. I mean,
Yeah.
how can you and how do you, and then someone's like, well, I don't know what I need. Well, you don't know what you need until you know how you feel. When you know how you feel, then you know which is why the inner child writing is, how do you feel and what do you need? So the first thing is, how do you feel? And then that gets you tuned in to be able to say, what do I need? And then when you can articulate that, you're able to communicate that to your partner or to an individual, to a boss or to a friend. Oh my God, does that really minimize a lot of drama in your life? Right? And I would
Yeah.
say most people in relationships do not have effective communication skills around letting people know what they need. That's a
Right.
hard thing.
Well,
It's one of the things I counter the most when I'm doing relationship counseling. The couple is not communicating honestly communicating, or they even know how to communicate their own needs. That's what the power of the needy child is.
Yeah. What were you
That's how
saying,
powerful.
Bobby? You were
so
just jumping in there for a minute.
for me, growing up with 6 kids, my mom died, my dad worked third shift. Again, not wanting to be needy, but having a lot of needs. In my mind, when you speak your needs, not only are you being needy, but you're being kind of greedy because everybody else needs stuff too. And
Right.
so you learn how to circumnavigate it by yourself, and then you learn how to ignore the rest of whatever else is going on because never mind, I don't need you, I got this. And therein lies another problem of telling people that you don't need them.
Which is the flip side of the needy child. Someone saying, I don't need help, I don't need anyone, which is never true. We're
Right.
interdependent. We're interdependent beings. There's always something that we need in terms of like our connection with human beings. And the thing is, like you said, if you can first understand it for yourself, then you can discern when and how much and where you communicate what your needs are. But again, how do you even navigate your own life if you don't know what you need?
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
That's how powerful that particular archetype is. I
And how
mean,
many people are doing that? How many people are navigating their lives without knowing what they even need?
most people,
Yeah, exactly.
most people are
That's why
living
this
like that.
conversation is so important.
So I always invite people. I'm like, I know it might be scary. I know you might access stuff that is uncomfortable, but think about the benefits and the opportunities that are available for awareness, and that how this is going to affect not only your internal relationship with yourself and how you function in life, but every relationship you have is going to be
Hmm.
changed just by understanding, at the very least, understanding what your conditioning is. That's the starting point. So, I mean, getting people to that place is powerful. And then it's just refining your relationship to each of those different things, right? That's what it comes down to. So, I mean, the needy child, you talked about that one. That is that whole part of like it. That's where codependence comes from, by the way,
Hmm.
right? People
Mm.
people who are in codependent relationships, unconscious codependent relationships, that's needy child. That's having wanting to be, it's grasping for attention because you're not available to yourself. So there's so much gold here, so much.
Yeah.
So I mean, so we talked about the overdramatic child, right? The entry point, that's the voice box. We talked about the needy child. You also mentioned the misunderstood child. Now, the misunderstood child is, I mean, I have this one. This is my conditioning. Um, it's that like individual who lives on the outskirts of everything, and they don't feel like they're, all of us are black sheep. All three of us here have
Hmm.
a black sheep energy to a kind of
Right.
degree, right? We
Yeah.
lived kind of like as on the outskirts of conventionality. We are, there is this whole idea of being a misfit outside of, and so therefore you're not understood by the conventional culture. So being misunderstood is very difficult because then you never feel validated. Because, I mean, remember, when we talk about love, if people talk about feeling love for somebody, one of the most um, common things that plays out in this conversation is when people feel understood, they feel loved, and being understood opens up the potential of loving somebody more, right? So if you
Hmm.
think about your partners, the partners that you've felt the most intimacy and connection with, you feel like they see you.
Yes.
Hmm.
You feel like they get you. How many times have you heard that? He just gets me. He gets me, and when he gets me, I feel seen. And when I feel seen and I feel understood, I'm more open to love.
Mm.
Right. So the
Hmm.
misunderstood child, that misfit, and especially if you were out of convention, you were living out of convention as a child, like me, like all of us here, in some ways, that feeling, if when you start to show up and understand that for yourself, that changes the game because you're no longer living in a victimized kind of like self-suffering, I'm a misfit, nobody's going to get me, so you're not isolated. So it's extremely powerful to start to understand yourself. And when you start to understand yourself, you don't need people to understand you anymore. I
Right.
don't require people to get me. I don't have to
Yeah.
have people understand where I'm coming from. And you one of some of the qualities of the misunderstood child are over explanation. So because you're always kind of trying to prove and like help people understand where you're coming from, so you tend to over explain your position on something, and or you explain it from 12 different angles because you really, really want the person to get it, right? And that really comes down to being understood or being seen or being validated because we weren't. So when you can self-validate and you can kind of work with that part of yourself, then you no longer have that unconscious need to get validated through the explanation or describing or explaining what's going on with yourself to somebody else. And it doesn't matter if people get you because you get you.
Hmm.
And
Right.
then you
Yeah.
will, ironically, you'll find more people who get you because you're comfortable with where you're at, and
Yeah.
you've changed the energy on the inside. Then when you'll start meeting like-minded black sheep like you, right?
All over the place.
All
Yeah.
over the place.
I
Like,
Right.
how
collect
amazing
these
is this?
people. Yes.
All of a sudden, there's a whole tribe out there.
Oh my God, there's a
Yes.
whole tribe. I
Right.
mean,
More than
most of
one.
most of the spiritual tribes are based on people who are misunderstood from their experiences and their tribes, and they're finding these pockets of people where they
Yes.
can validate each other in a way where you can say, I get that what you're saying, which is another way of being of really seeing and understanding somebody, which makes them feel connected and not isolated.
Right.
Right. So it's, again, that particular archetype is super powerful. It's also the misunderstood child loves to suffer. Like it lives, it's identified to its own story of suffering, because as a misfit, you always feel outside of. So the misunderstood child tends to have this what I call the unsolvable problem. My daughter used to play this when she'd come home from school. She'd come home and she'd have this problem, and no matter what solution we offered her, it was unsolvable, right? And then so I'd say we'd recognize that we'd spin with her in this whole thing, and that we wouldn't get any results. And I'd say, okay, we've given you all the feedback we have based on where we're coming from as parents, is what we can do. There's not much more we can do. It doesn't seem like you really want a solution, but there is always a solution to something. So we're going to leave you now in this experience, now that we've given you all the feedback we can give you, and you'll work it out. We'll hope that you can work it out with all the things we've given you. And 95% of the time, she comes down with a solution. But the misunderstood child spins in the unsolvable problem, because the unsolvable problem models that feeling of being outside of and not being understood. So again, that's a powerful thing. When you can understand yourself, you can get out of this spin of that there's no solution. So there's a kind of self-suffering that lives in this victimized state of the misunderstood child, right? That's the victimized person who feels victimized by their misfitness, by their outsideness, by the fact that nobody gets me, nobody understands. Have you ever heard someone say, nobody gets it, nobody understands what I'm talking about? Misunderstood child. So the thing that's powerful also is, once you learn some of these tools, you can identify when someone's talking to me. And I always say this when I'm working with clients: ask and pay attention. What fragment is the individual you're communicating with speaking from? And you won't
Yeah.
know that unless you know your own fragmentation, right? But if you're dealing with somebody who's in the misunderstood child, you're going to have a very different relationship and a very different mature meeting of that, as opposed to somebody who's dealing in the overdramatic child, right?
So
Very different.
where does martyrdom fall in all of that? Is that misunderstood also?
This martyrdom is big time in the misunderstood
Yeah.
child, big time. That's like one of
Yeah.
the martyrdom. Yeah. So anybody who has martyrdom typically has a lot of this misunderstood thing. And there's self-sacrifice and there's self-suffering in the martyrdom, which is really relates to the misunderstood child. It's a powerful one. It's one of the ones that was uncomfortable and very not pleasant for me to go into explore, because I didn't really want, no one really wants to admit some of those things. But when I started to get really honest about, I'm the one who's creating my own isolation through my own self-suffering, and there's a self-sacrifice going on here. When you start changing that pattern, and you can't change it till you can identify it, things change in the game in terms of being a martyr. Like, everybody's sacrificing yourself for everybody else, right? That changes when you start understanding deeper components of the misunderstood child. But
Yeah.
again, if you don't know, how do you meet it in a way that's conscious? Which is why I developed the map in the first place, because I found so many people who didn't know how to go in and start identifying and working with these parts of their consciousness. And it does change your entire relationship. When you understand yourself and you don't need someone else to understand you, that changes the way you engage with relationships completely. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the three we covered: over dramatic, misunderstood, needy. Then we could talk about another one, which is which is the typical entitlement. You know, the kid who's entitled and who's spoiled rotten, and they're demanding, and there's gluttony, and it's excessive, and they're self-centered. Overindulged child, right? That's the classic spoiled kid who's been given everything, and now they feel entitled to get everything wherever they are, right? And again, that's a fairly dangerous, and that's the epitome of narcissism.
Mm.
If you think about like the narcissistic energy, the overindulged child is very much a big part of that. That's the one that feels entitled, ungrateful, demanding. Every desire is supposed to be indulged. They feel resentful if they don't get their desire delivered. That that the whole idea of being spoiled grows from a lack of boundaries. So if that child didn't get boundaries, they didn't have structure, and they didn't have support in their upbringing. So that overindulged child takes, and it feels like it deserves to take wherever it is, however it is, and so it's very selfish. It's very self-oriented. It can be manipulative. It can be pampering. It can be but underneath all of this excessiveness is insecurity. Because what happened is there was no real nurturing. There were no real boundaries, and so there's like a sense of like emotional impoverishment, because like you didn't get stuff, you didn't get what you needed emotionally, you got stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So or you got over gluttonized attention, which was a band-aid for true emotional support. So that is another fragment of not when people start to see that fragment, they're like, I don't want to admit that I have that patterning. I'm like, but admitting that helps with addiction. That helps you understand self-centeredness. That helps you develop compassion. It helps you understand how to relate to other people instead of just getting what you want. I mean, again, very, very powerful. And it's the foundation, the untapped foundation of dealing with a narcissistic personality. So that's that darker side of the wounded inner child that comes from being spoiled. Like it's such an interesting term, spoiled. Like when food is spoiled, it's not good for anything. You can't eat it anymore. Well, when the overindulged child was spoiled with the lack of emotional support, but with other stuff, then that child still feels the need to have and get, and that's all just trying to fill the hole of not having had someone truly available for it.
Right.
I've worked with parents who've done this to their children, and I mean unconsciously, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it comes from a reaction for what they didn't get. Like a lot of people are like, I want to give my children everything I didn't get. I'm like, no, 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 no. Don't give your children everything you didn't get. Give your children all the availability you didn't get. Be more available. Give them the emotional support you didn't get. Don't put stuff in there. Don't make it stuff. Make it connection, right? So I mean, don't give them everything. Teach them everything that you didn't receive. That will create a very different kind of relationship with your children, right?
Yeah.
Entitled children, they're selfish, and it's
Yeah.
a parent's fault. I mean, I don't want to judge. I'm not judging a parent, but it's a parent's responsibility. That parent is working from their unconscious patterning if they're giving their kid everything and they're not giving them boundaries and real emotional support and letting them feel the consequences of their actions. And a no is a very powerful thing. I mean, during COVID, I really appreciated, and some people, it's not necessarily a popular opinion, but it was powerful in our family. Our kids, for the first time, in a culture of instant gratification, getting whatever you want whenever you want. You can get food delivered. You can get all the information you want from the internet in seconds. When the world said no to the stuff that they could get like this, they had to become more resourceful and understand how to do things and be creative and do things differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was powerful for my kids because the no wasn't coming from us. It was coming from the outer environment, right? And
Yeah.
in our age group, we had no's all the time, right? Like you
Right.
couldn't just pick up your phone and talk to anybody. You had to go home, get the phone off the wall. Maybe there was a message machine in your house. The person got a message. And if you weren't there to pick up the phone, too bad,
And I don't
right?
know about your house, but if you wanted to pick up that phone and make a phone call, you better have permission first.
Well, and you might have to share that with someone else.
Yeah.
Back then,
That's
they had party lines, and no, there was no such a thing when I grew up as, a machine that left you messages.
right.
It's an
Yeah.
available.
So think about all the no's we received, like just from the
Mm-hmm.
general environment that we had to work around and be creative. An overindulged child has none of that. And so if that's the case, they feel entitled to get anything they want, whenever they demand it. And it's just feeling their insecurity that's already present. So if you're more emotionally available, if you draw boundaries with this part of the medicine of this, you change the game in terms of that overindulged energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the energy of the addict, by the way. The overindulged energy, that is the fundamental energy of the addict. It's like hedonism to the point of trying to fill something that can't be filled by stuff, by drugs, by attention, by sex, by video games, by likes on your phone, by whatever, right? But it's a big part of our culture right now. We have a very overindulged culture.
Yeah.
Sense gratification, instant sense gratification as much as possible. So we see a lot of that particular one. So we've done overdramatic, misunderstood, needy, overindulged. Um, the other one is frozen, right? Frozen child is that you feel like when you're procrastinating, that's the frozen child. Like if you're a procrastinator, I always say I create some of the most powerful art when I'm procrastinating doing stuff that I need to be doing.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
I'm saying
Yes,
you
absolutely.
go do all these other tasks that have to get done, and then you're like, oh, I accomplished all that stuff, but you're avoiding the thing that you actually have to do, and you're
Mm-hmm.
justifying it by doing something else. That's part of that is the fear of executing, because we're afraid we're not going to get it right. We're afraid it's going to be wrong when we do it. And so we get into this energy of waiting and procrastinating, and people get really frozen when they get confronted with something and they don't know how to how to handle it. That trauma often you'll get into this frozen place. And that happens emotionally in relationships. So if you enter into a relationship that has an abuse energy to it and you don't know how to handle that, you freeze.
Yeah.
Right? You do nothing. So it comes from trauma, and it
Mm-hmm.
comes from and the thing with the frozen child is it knows that it needs to do it, but it just doesn't seem to know how. So it's aware. There's an awareness that you're not moving forward, and you're stuck, and you're waiting, and you're trying to wait for the perfect moment to execute, waiting for the mothership to come, waiting for Godot, whatever you're waiting for. That's all frozen child, right? And so someone's like, well, how do I work with frozen child? I'm like, action. In fact, it doesn't even really matter what the action is at first. Just you have to break through that frozen energy, and you break through that frozen energy by doing something. Ideally, something towards what you want, your task, or what you're working with. But even if
Yeah.
it's not, it still works to break the energy of waiting and being stuck, of being frozen, of being like petrified, of being in that whole energy of that, right? And a lot of people come to me and they say to me, and emotionally, spiritually, and in my relationships, I feel stuck. That's them speaking from the frozen child. When someone says, I feel stuck, they're speaking from the frozen child.
Wow, I work with a lot of frozen children. I can't even begin to tell you how many times a week someone will send me a message and say, I don't know what to do. I'm stuck. I feel
That's
stuck. I can't get out of this. And it is literally probably hundreds of people a year
so
that tell
that
me
so
that.
what we're dealing a lot with, and so the fact that you can
Hmm.
identify that, then you're like,
Yeah,
okay, if I know you're stuck, then let's give you something, anything to do.
right,
Let's get that energy moving, because everything about the frozen child is withholding any kind of empowered action out of fear,
right.
right? So
Is that
that's interesting that you deal with a lot of frozen
A
children. That's
lot of
interesting.
frozen children. Yeah.
Very interesting.
I think procrastination, at least for me, comes from, again, not knowing how to do it, not knowing where to
Right.
start. There's that. But in terms of being frozen, is there a component there of perhaps some abuse, growing up, being yelled at kind of thing? You're so
Afraid to
frozen.
do it wrong.
Right, exactly. Because you're
Yeah.
afraid to be judged.
You're
Yeah.
afraid to be judged, right? So
Hmm.
there's a disempowered energy. Like if you had the critical parent, and that critical parent was, you'll never accomplish anything, why do you bother? Like when you get that energy of like, well, that feeling judged and feeling criticized for doing something, no matter what you did, it was wrong. Well, you're gonna have probably of conditioning of the frozen child, because there's
Hmm.
that terror unconsciously, even though your parent is no longer with you when you're an adult, the voice is in there that says, what do you think you're doing? Or, or the criticism of what doing it. So yes, Part of that frozen child is the trauma of feeling criticized, which means that there was no self-honoring and there was no honoring from the parent. A parent who honors their child, you don't get a frozen child. You don't create a frozen child from an honoring parent. It means on some level you weren't honored, you weren't seen, you weren't heard, you weren't honored, and you were criticized. So yes, it is trauma-based. Absolutely.
A lot of
And it's a
shame.
big one. It's a big one. I mean, a lot of people feel it, they don't know what it is, and then they judge themselves for the fact that they're stuck. And I mean, like you, I hear it all the time. I feel stuck. I don't know what to do. And the best thing to do is
Yeah.
when you're dealing with that fragment is the first thing you do is get them identified as the fact of why they don't want to move. And then it's just execute anything to get the energy moving. And then ideally you get them executing in a way towards their goal, towards something that's meaningful. So it changes the game a little bit. But the first thing is you have to be available to that. If you're not available to that, you don't know that's going on. How do you work with it?
Right.
Right.
Because it's very petrifying. It can be some people can be frozen for years they're emotionally frozen. Some people are deeply emotionally frozen because of the conditioning and some of the criticism and some of the trauma they received. That's all part of the frozen child, right? Basically, the frozen child believes it's ultimately damaged and powerless. It believes in powerlessness instead of its own power. So it's not empowered. It's victimized and feels terrified that it doesn't have what it takes to move forward. So that's all insecurity. That means there was no support.
For me, a lot of my frozenness comes in the area of technology. I'll be straight up about that. Like,
I'm powerless with technology.
it's not that I'm powerless, it's that I don't understand it. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just really interesting. And I think, a lot of people are like, well, just jump in. If you make a mistake, start over. I have jumped in and frozen computers like the blue screen of death. So there's a little financial fear behind that too, because then I know I'm going to have to replace that computer.
Right.
Right. It's also about asking for your needs. If you know you're not adept in the world of technology and you know how to ask for your needs, you can get somebody to assist you in the process. So a frozen child wouldn't do anything. They'd just be like, blue screen of death. I don't know what to do. I'm just not gonna. Hopefully, if I just stand here and wait, things will change.
Yeah, it depends. But sometimes when I ask for help, I'm like, no, I'm done helping you. I've already told you this 6 times. I'm done helping you.
Turn it off and then turn it back on, and
that's a technique.
It doesn't come on. Now you
Yeah.
have no one to communicate with because you can't get your computer on.
That's right. Yeah.
But that whole frozen thing is it's a human element. Listen, we often talk about cortisol and like the fight or flight. Well, oftentimes fight, flight, and freeze is part of the same thing, because a lot of people don't include freeze, but fight or flight is like the reptilian brain of our instinctual nature, but freeze is also part of our instinctual nature.
Yeah.
So I always include that in fight, flight. I was like, there's fight, there's flight, but there's also freeze. And that's the frozen child. That's coming from that reactive. And remember, all the wounded stuff is reactive. It's not responsive. It's our reaction, unconscious, immature reaction in a way that we're not aware of to what's going on around us. Then again, knowing and understanding it allows you the ability to be available, which changes your relationship to it and the influence that this stuff has. The last and final one is probably the most misunderstood, but it is, and it's very palpable, is I call it the lost child. And the lost child is basically, if you want a word that identifies this aspect, it's disassociation.
Yes.
So with extreme levels of trauma, anybody who's had extreme levels of trauma, they've learned techniques to disassociate from their emotional body, and then that disassociation is a way of protection, which is another tool that the ego uses in order to protect itself, is to disassociate and compartmentalize different experiences so that they're not accessible, right? So the way I describe someone who has true disassociative of qualities is that they get on a car and they go to drive. Say they're driving from one city to the other city. They get in the car, and as they start driving to the city, they forgot the city that they were in. And then when they actually get to the city that they're going to, they forgot how they got there. So a dissociative personality they don't know they're dissociative. They don't know. And it's really challenging to work with it. When I've had a lot of clients who have this, it comes from severe trauma. There's usually some profound secret that's underneath all of that dissociative nature that they don't want to feel or experience or see. And the avoidance is the management of dealing with that deep trauma, whatever it is. So a lot
Right.
of people, if they don't know how much they were abused, like I had a client I was working with, and she was abused by her uncle, and she didn't know it, but she had these incredible dissociative experiences, and she didn't know how to. And it's frustrating for her partner too, because her partner would be like, with the individual, he'd say, "I know she's disassociating, but she doesn't remember." So it's a very interesting way to work with them. You got to build the story. You got to teach them when they disassociate, what happens, what's the trigger that makes them want to disassociate. And eventually they have to get to the secret that's underneath of there that they're trying to avoid. Once my client, this individual I was working with, after 4 years of working with her, once she actually got to that place and she felt and saw the trauma, her entire life changed. Like when I mean that, like she created more work, she created more abundance, I mean, it was insane to watch the ripple effect of her finally getting honest and getting clear and getting deep into the wound of what had happened to her and feeling the pain of that instead of unconsciously avoiding it. So a dissociative personality, they're not super common, but it comes from profound abuse, right? And someone who's that disassociative and says, I've never had anything happen to me, I'm like, I don't buy it. Because you don't disassociate at that level unless there's some profound trauma that's playing out that you don't want to see.
Right.
And some people, when they do see it, then they attack me because they're like, why did you make me see that? I'm like, I didn't make you see it. It came up and I'm working with you on it. But a lot of people, they don't want to handle the pain and they don't want to confront whatever that thing is. And they will find a way to check out even after they've touched it. But once you've touched it, once you've seen it, once it's available to you, now you have the opportunity to heal it. That's how I look at it.
Yeah.
So we all have some dissociative qualities, like we can disassociate and compartmentalize in some areas. Some people are very disassociated with their feelings. Like they just do not have a connection to their emotional body. That's a form of disassociation. So the layers and the degrees of it are directly proportionate to the amount of trauma that you're trying to avoid. So again, think about that. If you spend your life in a disassociative lost child state, you feel isolated, you feel alone, you feel disconnected, you don't know why you're disassociating. That's a really discombobulated way of functioning in the world. And there's a lot of people who function that way.
Yeah,
They don't
I
know.
couldn't, I was thinking of different people when you were talking who like completely fit that. Yeah.
So again,
Yeah.
we all have a little bit of it, right? And
Hmm.
just a matter of being able to, if this is a big part of you, then you know that there's something in there to work with. And so that's, again, very specific. And that's why that's kind of at the end. If you think about the cycle of all the different patterns, we go over dramatic, misunderstood, needy, overindulged, frozen, and then disassociative or lost child is kind of like the final one on the map because it's intense. It's a very intense version of being withdrawn and distant and checked out, right? So again, knowing that changes everything, especially if you're checking out of your feelings. Because if you're checking out of your feelings, you don't know how you feel. How do you know what you need? How do you
Right.
communicate? Right. So it's all kind of woven together in that area.
So
So
does
those
it help?
go
Does
ahead.
it help when you're working with clients and you're going through all of the 6 archetypes here? When you start at one and you go through all of that, does it help at the end to find out that they're disassociating because they've gone through the rest of them? Does that help cycle it through, or is it just automatically the problem?
Because of the intense nature of that lost child, that doesn't tend to be the first one that they touch to explore. In other words, like you said, you kind of have to work up to it. Because if there's something you're hiding deep in the recesses of your unconscious that is so traumatic that you don't want to look at, the first thing you're going to have to do is get really available to the different fragments. Usually that's one of the last things that you work on if it's there, if it's in someone's consciousness. It takes a while and it takes a lot of patience. It takes infinite amounts of compassion to work with it. and you have to teach the individual self-compassion, because oftentimes they don't know, and it's very, very frustrating and very confusing when they can't remember why they checked out. I mean, and a lot of people don't have patience with them. They go, "Oh, you're just doing that because you don't want to deal with it." No, they don't know. They need help. And so compassion is such a huge piece to internally with yourself, to work on this, to have compassion for that disassociative nature, and also to keep tuning into your feelings and staying available. And that's how I work with the individual, slowly moving her into being available to her feelings. And then when she got comfortable being available to her lesser feelings, she was finally available to look at some of this dark stuff that had happened to her that she was avoiding. And I'm telling you, the day she had that opening, because I remember it, I saw a complete change in her personality. Her husband saw a complete change in her personality. And within 3 months, her life was totally different, because she reclaimed that fragment that was way disassociated.
Mm-hmm.
So she was finally dealing with the thing that she wasn't dealing with. You know how much energy that freed up for her? Her whole life force, the amount of energy to repress and to avoid something is so huge in the consciousness. When you start to deal with that and you reclaim all that energy, she had more vitality, she had more creativity, she had more sexuality, she was open sensually. I mean, it was like a totally different person. Totally different person.
It is
So
a
there,
totally different person because you
yep,
just unburied the person that was there.
that's right. You
Yeah,
dug them out of the coffin that they put themselves in, right?
exactly. And that takes a no, I just want to interject this. That takes a huge amount of courage
It does.
to face that depth of darkness. And I mean, I know because I've done it. I don't share a lot of details about my story, but I came from that. I came from the severe abuse. I came from the severe poverty. I came from the places other people don't want to hear about. And the amount of courage that it took, and the amount of time it took to find that courage was felt at times insurmountable.
Yeah, and
And
the
yeah,
fact that you could see the difference in your life having kind
oh,
of been able to
totally.
finally deal with that stuff, right?
Hmm.
So this is very poignant for you then.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I've been sitting here with goosebumps pretty much the whole time you've been talking. So, yeah, because I've been through all of this, and I didn't have that exact program, but I did have help. I had professional help to get through it because there's no way I would have gotten through all of that trauma on my own.
And
There's
here's
no
the thing,
way.
you are 100% right. With this specific fragment, it is
Hmm.
very, I don't know many people who've done it without help. In fact,
Right.
I don't know anyone, to be honest with you,
I haven't
who
either.
to
Yeah.
deal with that disassociative energy without somebody who's holding space and continually lovingly bringing them back into
Hmm.
a place where they can deal with whatever it was that they were avoiding, that was so traumatic that they had to check out and fragment themselves that way,
Right. And
right?
some people just don't even get there. They
Right.
just, they try, but they just can't get there. And, it's, um, I might be misspeaking here, but it was my understanding that that's where like a split personality comes from, or multiple personality disorder comes from, is that deep trauma of that child, the lost child.
I agree that
Yeah.
when you have that level of disassociation combined
Hmm.
with a huge protection of like not wanting to access that, then there are, we can look at some of the dynamics and say yes, that some split personality, psychic splits, like
Hmm.
just on the inability to kind of put it all back together.
Right.
It can be from very profound dissociative tendencies, which comes from deep trauma. It
Right.
just does. Nobody who's disassociated doesn't have trauma. Let's be
Right.
clear.
Exactly.
Like,
Nobody does that just because it's fun.
nobody
No,
does it because it's fun.
no.
Absolutely not. And that's why you have to have so much compassion and
Hmm.
availability. And if you can get into your feelings, the first place, if you can get people feeling, you can get them accessing, they can slowly start to unravel that experience. And it takes time. It
It
does not
does.
happen overnight. You know as well as I do.
Oh, yeah.
There's a process involved. And a lot of
Hmm.
people bail before the process is over, right?
Yeah,
Before
because
they
that,
actually,
let's just say it, that shit hurts.
it does.
It hurts deep. And some people cannot deal with the awareness of that level of pain. I completely understand that. It took me several
Yeah.
tries to get through it. I didn't just get up one day and say, "Oh, you know what? just going to face these deep traumas and bring up all these things that I buried and face it head on, and tomorrow I start my new life." It just doesn't
No,
can't do
that's
it
not
that
the
way.
thought process.
No, not at all. Not at
Typically
all.
not.
Nope.
Usually it's a catalyst in your world that forces you that you have to deal with it. Because
Right.
human beings, typically, we don't deal with stuff until we absolutely are forced to deal with it. Like
That is true.
pain is a very motivating factor,
Yes.
right? So
Yeah.
when it becomes when the ability to repress it is less effective than the pain that you're feeling, when the pain you're feeling becomes overwhelming, then usually we start facing stuff we don't want to face. Like
Hmm.
I had somebody call me the other day and he's like, I can't live with myself anymore. And in my response was, that's fantastic, right? And he's
Yeah,
like, it doesn't feel fantastic. I'm like, what you're
exactly.
telling me is you're in a position where you're now ready to do something that you wouldn't
Hmm.
done before because the pain is so overwhelming. You're trying to find a solution, and avoiding the pain, which has only been creating more pain, is not the method anymore.
Right.
So it usually requires a fairly big spiritual Mack truck for someone to deal with something like.
Yes, it does.
And
Yes, it
so,
does.
speaking from experience, you know what I'm
Hmm.
talking about.
Yep.
So those are the six archetypes, right? Over
Yeah.
dramatic, which is the voice box. That's the alert system of the wounded inner child. Misunderstood child, which is that like self-sacrificing, spinning in the unsolvable problem misfit who's kind of doesn't feel understood by the relative conventional world. There's the needy child, which is all about unmet needs and codependence and trying to grasp for your needs instead of being able to ask for them. There's the overindulged child, which is the epitome of being spoiled and then creates that insecurity in the child. There's that frozen child that is the inability to move just because it's frozen and terrified that it's going to be criticized or judged for whatever moving, and they've internalized that. And then you have the lost child that's all about that disassociative quality. Those are the six major archetypes of the wounded inner child. This is your gold.
Yeah.
If you choose to see it that way, you can change your entire life by accessing, learning, and becoming available to these different parts of you. Every relationship in your life fundamentally changes when you become less immature and unconscious about these aspects of yourself. That's
Right.
why I say it's so powerful, right? Not comfortable, not
No.
necessarily easy. Nobody does it willingly.
No, probably not.
But this spiritual work fundamentally changes the way, and again, not only the way every relationship works, but how you view every spiritual experience that happens for you. You know how many
Hmm.
people have spiritual experience and they're victimized by the very experience that their consciousness is creating for them, right?
Yeah.
That's them living in the wounded inner child. I've
Hmm.
seen more new age people living in the wounded inner child than living in maturity,
Oh, yeah,
right?
absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
I mean,
Yeah.
you've been to enough expos and you've seen enough different
Oh,
things.
yeah.
You know how people have a immature relationship to their spiritual path?
Hmm.
That means they haven't accessed their wounded inner child.
Right.
They have no work around it, which is why I say when you're doing inner child work, it's very different work to be working on the radiant, cultivating the radiant sides. Because a lot of people say, you know what? I can work on the wounded inner child by cultivating all the radiant aspects of my being. And the answer is no, it's not the same. It
Not the
helps,
same.
but it is not the same kind of work,
Yeah.
not the same kind of stuff. I have spent so much time in this space working on this. This was the starting point of some of my most powerful spiritual awakenings because you get
Same.
access to yourself in ways that you never have.
Exactly the same for me. Yeah.
It's
I'm
about
so
creating.
glad we're having the conversation because I feel like this is one of those missing things in the spiritual world that people don't talk about. That is, if you just went there and did it, you would see this fundamental shift in everything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really
So, I mean, I always get excited. They're like, you get so excited about talking about woundedness. And I'm like, no, I'm excited about the potential that's there for you as an individual to grow, not the wounds. I'm not glorifying your wounds. What I'm doing is
Right.
saying, but if you go in there and do this, and don't take my word for it. Go in and try. You will see the shifts that happen as you start to investigate these different parts of yourself, right, Bobby? Like as you started going in and working on this stuff, you saw the changes.
Well, you grow trust in yourself and you grow trust in the information to let go a little bit. But in addition to that, then you're growing self-love and self-acceptance and all the things that propel you forward, because you're at the end of the day, inside there somewhere is some sort of love, regardless of what you've been told of not being worth it and not, all the other stuff. You got to give yourself a chance if you want to continue on. You can't stay in the same spot you've been staying because it doesn't work well. So the whole concept of all of this is so valuable. Oh my God.
Oh, yeah.
This is life-changing. This is where I started. This is where and I'm telling you, this is not easy. And I had a meltdown the first time I did it. And I thought, oh my God, you are the worst person in the whole world. You have every one of these things, and here I am today doing this. Who knew?
Yeah, exactly.
But you said a powerful thing. When people talk about self-love, they're like, I'm practicing self-love. This is practicing self-love.
Yes.
I would say becoming available to your own pain is one of the most self-loving things you could possibly do as a being.
Agreed.
Because that pain that you're not available to is affecting you. Whether you want to believe it or not, it's influencing covertly everything you're doing without you even knowing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Every reaction you have to everything is there.
Everything. Yeah.
So-
Exactly. And even after doing all this work, sometimes it still comes up anyway.
Absolutely.
I could say I did this 20 years ago and look at that. I just got hit with another board in the head.
Well,
It comes up.
The way that our being processes is it only gives you what you can handle. And it's in layers and phases. I always say it's like a buffet. I've said this millions of times. I love this analogy. When you go to the buffet and you grab they have the spring-loaded thing with the plates, and you take a plate off the top, and then the spring-loaded thing comes up and there's new plates, and then you keep pulling plates off. Eventually you get to the point where the container of that specific issue is empty. That's what our consciousness does. Whenever you clear something, well, the next thing comes up for you to work on. Not because you're getting punished, not because you're victimized, because you're ready.
Yes.
You're ready to deal with it. And you're not going to get something that you're not ready. So, even if you've done the work 15 years ago, you are going to continue to have new plates of stuff come up, because the whole point is purification. You'll spend the rest of your life purifying. First, you purify all your distortions. And then once you purify all your distortions, you spend the rest of your life refining your refinements. So the first part of the game is you have to pull off these plates and you have to get in there in the mix and do it. And that is the way consciousness works. Even 15 years later, something will come up and you're like, wait a second, that's a nuanced, very subtle version of that wound. That's interesting. It's coming up in that way. So you'll relate to it differently too. You certainly relate to it differently now, 20 years later than you did.
Absolutely. Well, now I know what it is. Now I know what it is. When, the first time, maybe even the first 5 times you go through it, you might not know what it is. And and the thing is that the more you do it, the more that you develop your own process. Even within using another process, everyone develops their own process.
Absolutely.
And once you've got the process, the first time I went through it, it probably took 5 or 6 years. Now it can happen in a matter of 2 or 3 days, sometimes less, because you have that process. You now have learned how to do it. You have learned how to talk to that inner child in a way that they're not going to go and run and hide, like they did before, because you've already developed a relationship with that inner child, and now she or he, whatever the case might be, trusts you. And when your inner child trusts you, you can work through that faster.
That is very well said. Very well said. Which is spoken from someone who's done the work, because someone who hasn't done the work can't talk like that.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you're like, the trust, when your inner child trusts you, the game changes.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely. It's not even the same game. You're in a
completely different reality. Because that integration creates a kind of harmony, which gives you access to so many parts of your consciousness, which you would never have tasted. And so that availability to the wounded inner child, that availability to the radiant inner child, to the whole inner child, changes the game in so many profound ways. It's
Yes.
fundamental. Like I said, it's a fundamental tool, and it is, for me, one of the missing components in the New Age world in terms of the process of spiritual development. Because you have your spiritual development, but you are going to filter all spiritual development through how you perceive it. And how you perceive it is based on your personality structure.
Right.
Right.
That's the missing piece. As far as I'm concerned, this is the missing link in you becoming a more mature, spiritually mature individual. Because you
Right.
can live in that spiritually immature space and be victimized by your own process for most of your life. I know
Right.
many New Agers who are.
Well,
And they get angry with me when I say, listen, don't be victimized by the very thing your consciousness is giving you to grow. I mean, do you see how that is not effective as a method of kind of self-realization? Not an effective method.
right. Well, and let's be clear, just because you're talking about spiritual growth and spiritual development, it doesn't mean at all that you're talking about religion. And some people get
No,
mixed
no.
up about that.
Yeah.
This is spiritual about your own soul, your own spirituality, and learning more about yourself. And now, that being said, we are out of time.
Yeah.
So we could
We
go
were
on
out of
and-
time 20 minutes ago.
So I'm not watching the clock. So just to let everybody know, Markus is back in town. And by the way, he's doing a talk at Angel Light on a map of consciousness, which is what we're talking about here today.
Yeah, there's some of that we're going to be talking about for sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So he's in town from the 11th through the 22nd of September. Take a look at his website, sign up for some of his talks, his meditations, his spiritual growth patterns. He's at several different locations in Wisconsin this time. He's branching out. And I just wanted to tell you all, thank you so much for coming today. If you have any questions, any comments, let us know through, comment through YouTube. Reach out and contact Markus at markuskasunich.com and take a look at the calendar. You guys will be so satisfied. He is a pot of gold. That's why we keep bringing him back. I want to share him with the world. I want everybody to be healthy and to get what they need in their own spiritual growth. So that being said, ring the bell, hit the notification button, and like our stuff and share it with your subscribe.
Thank you.
No, you won't get a magazine. Won't cost you anything.
You're not locking into anything here. Just hit that subscribe button, please.
Thank you so much for having me. And what I do appreciate about this forum is the nature of the conversations we can have, because again, I feel like some of these pieces are not openly discussed in certain circles, and I feel like the knowledge can help so many people.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
thank you for the privilege of being here with you guys today and having the conversation and having this intense conversation. It's not an easy conversation.
No,
but
it
isn't. But it is a powerful one.
And thank you for joining us again and sharing your wisdom. I know that the people who tune into the show, who listen, who catch us on other social media outlets that we release this to, everyone benefits. And thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom.
We're all part of the same tribe.
We
Take
are.
care, you guys. Thanks for everything.
All right.
Thanks again. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Have a great week.
Bye-bye.